So the previous lesson fundamentally took us on an introduction to our studies in medieval philosophy. This video I want to just spend a little bit more time contextualizing medieval philosophy, talking about how we can contextualize medieval philosophy, and just taking something of a foundational overview of the subject before going into the specifics of the writings and the works and the lives and the philosophy of people like Augustine and Aquinas and Anselm, Athanasius, etc., etc., etc. I just want to really highlight a number of the key themes that are essentially relevant for our conversation in our studies in medieval philosophy. Okay. So we'll just spend some time broadly looking at some of the themes within the subject of medieval philosophy, examine some of the challenges that are really faced with studying medieval philosophy, trying to pick out, for example, some of the philosophy where we are looking at philosophy and theology. It's sometimes difficult to pick out the philosophy from this particular topic. And then we will just fundamentally have a better understanding of the foundations of this topic before we start to think about it in more detail as time goes on in the future. So this video, as I've said, is essentially contextualizing medieval philosophy. Now, according to, and as cited by Bertrand Russell in his own writings, A History of Western Philosophy, this particular period of time in that book is titled Catholic Philosophy. Which is very, very interesting because essentially it seems to be the case that pretty much everybody who writes on the history of Western philosophy, whether it be people like Bertrand Russell or whether it be people like Anthony Kenny, for example, they seem to just be writing from the perspective of dividing Western philosophy into four broad topics, into four broad periods. You sort of have the classical period of the ancients, so you have the people like the pre-Socratics who we've spoken about, and then you get into the writings of, well, not necessarily the writings of Socrates, but the philosophy of Socrates, people like Plato, and then people like Aristotle. You then sort of go into some of the Roman philosophy to an extent, writings like Cicero, for example, some of the later Stoics that existed in this period. And then you have the medieval period, this sort of medieval period beginning in and around the writings of Augustine and ending at the sort of Renaissance. And then you have the early modern and the modern. So it seems to be the case that everyone fits their histories of Western philosophy into those kinds of broad four chunks. Bertrand Russell is no different, but he titles, like I said, he titles this particular period of history as Catholic philosophy. And it's easy to understand why this is the case, because this study of Western philosophy during this period of medieval history, the study of medieval philosophy, begins with the writings of Augustine, Saint Augustine of Hippo, and then will end towards the sort of humanist Renaissance. That's how it is described by both Bertrand Russell and also by Anthony Kenny in both of their respective writings. Now, the period is influenced most heavily by, on the one hand, Catholicism, especially within the deep, truly Western period, the sort of scholastic movements. You also have the pre-scholasticism that existed as well, and fundamentally, a lot of the philosophers that we're going to be talking about were church fathers, were saints, and fundamentally wrote within the context of theology. They wrote about philosophical principles. They wrote about the philosophy of religion. They wrote about metaphysics. They wrote about time and ethics and all of these different things, but they did so from a strictly Catholic perspective, talking about reference to the biblical texts. We also have to make reference to the fact that there was, during this period, a golden age in Islam, in the Muslim world. So you have to think this takes place in relation to not just philosophy, but also to science and to literature and to arts. This is really what is known as the golden age of Islam. And so the result here is that Islamic philosophy is also quite heavily influential during this period. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about Catholicism. We're going to be talking about quite a lot of theology and a lot of Christian thoughts. And so the result here is that fundamentally, we have to think about the fact that that we're talking about trying to delineate philosophy from theology during this period. Something that is not necessarily that easy to do, but is far easier to do in other periods. So when we look at early modern philosophy, for example, when we look at people like Descartes and people like David Hume, we will see that while they do talk about religion, Descartes specifically talks a lot about religion, these people aren't theologians. They're not saints. These people are philosophers and scientists. In the classical period, there was no reference to Christianity because Christianity in ancient Greece didn't exist. There was no such thing as Christianity. There wasn't even such thing as Judaism, for example. And so the result of this is, and then obviously when we get to the truly modern period, when we're talking about people like Marx, and when we're talking about people like Quine and Russell and Wittgenstein, okay, these are people who of course do not reference to a great extent religion and are not considered to be religious saints or church fathers, and so it is only really this medieval period that is so enamored by religion and is so enamored by the development of religious thought. One of the most important writers in the history of Western philosophy, who we have cited below in the citations as well as in further reading, is Anthony Kenny. Now, he noted that it wasn't until relatively recently, the last few decades and such, that the history of Western philosophy even taught this period in any great detail. For the most part, he argues that they skipped over quite a lot of the writings of medieval thinkers. So they sort of jumped from Aquinas to Descartes. So they sort of maybe touch over on people like Augustine and maybe reference here and there a little bit of Anselm. But for the most part, they will just cite Aquinas, who is of course a very famous and very important influential philosopher, and then they'll just jump to Descartes. And so the result here is that medieval philosophy doesn't really get much of a look in compared to that of the early modern, the classical, and the truly modern areas of philosophy. There are a number of reasons why this is arguably the case, and Kenny makes a number of arguments as to why this is the case. Firstly, he makes the point, as I've made or at other points in this video, that there is difficult to strike a clear delineation between philosophy and theology during this period, and so the result of that is, of course, that it might be quite uncomfortable waters to be, as a philosopher, diving into a lot of theological texts and a lot of biblical interpretation and a lot of writings on biblical principles like Trinitarianism and things like the Council of Nicaea and acceptance of things like the Holy Trinity and things like original sin and the doctrine of grace and Gnosticism and Marcionism, all of these different very early Christian ideas in the development of Christianity, when Christianity was really conflicted with itself as to what the true doctrines of the biblical texts actually represented. In some of the really early periods of Christian history, you find that some of the biblical texts, specifically the New Testament, hadn't even been written or had only just been written. And so the point here is that there was a lot of umming and ahhing and a lot of debating as to really what these things meant and what things counted as being true Christian doctrine. And so that's why you have things like, for example, the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, the establishment of a truly unified theory of Christian doctrine, which of course then breaks into pieces when we get to things like the Great Schism between Catholicism and the sort of Eastern Orthodox or the Byzantine orthodoxy of Christianity. And then of course you get the Reformation, which then divides Catholicism even more into the sort of newer Protestantism ideas and Arminianism, for example, and then you also have continuing this idea of Catholicism. All of this, though, what I've just been speaking about, the rant that I've just done, are theological conversations. These are theological ideas. And you probably must be thinking, well, this isn't the Theology Academy, okay? That's linked in the description below. This is something else. This is a philosophy channel. So how can we really make a clear delineation? And fundamentally, it's going to be difficult to, okay? When we talk about Anselm, we're going to be talking about Anselm's arguments for the existence of God, his ontological argument, his writings in Proslogium, for example. And so the response here is that you could theoretically have studied this in a theology class as well as a philosophy class, the two merged together. There's also a language barrier at this period of history as well. For the most part, philosophers being less able to comprehend the content of medieval philosophy because it was, for the most part, written in classical Latin. No one really knew Latin as it becomes a dead language as time goes on, and as people start to contextualize their philosophy in English and in French and in German and in Spanish, etc., etc., etc. And so classical Latin sort of loses its influence towards the as we get into the early medieval, the early modern and the modern periods of philosophy. Kenny also notes that One of the things that happens during the period of medieval philosophy is something of a professionalization of the subject. It goes from being something that is just done by people who who are potentially rich, who come from quite wealthy families, and who are essentially able to just sit around and think all day at Plato's Academy, for example, or be a follower of people like Pythagoras, or become a Stoic. It becomes something of a professional environment, a professionalized subject. This, of course, takes with it the idea of it being relatively exclusionary in character. Whereas the philosophy of the classical world, as I said, was partaken by a lot of people. There are still arguments to be had, as I mentioned, about the accessibility of people who were born into wealthy families. But if you were born into a wealthy family in classical Athens, for example, and if you had some certain influence, then you had, like I said, the time and the wealth and the ability to sit around in Plato's Academy and start writing dialogues like people like Socrates and stuff. But the sort of professionalized nature of philosophy that takes place in the medieval period meant that people outside this world of the profession are unable to engage in it in a similar kind of way. And then the final point of note as to why medieval philosophy isn't considered to have so much influence, or as much influence as other periods do, is the fact that there is a distinct lack of name recognition for the vast majority of medieval philosophers. Really, at this point now, before we have gone through these lessons, and before you have gone through these lessons that we have made, name as many medieval philosophers that really sit in this medieval period that you know as possible. You might come up with a few. There are famous names. There's people like Aquinas, as I've mentioned. I've mentioned quite a lot of Augustine, maybe Anselm as well. These are the three names that I've sort of made reference to at multiple points during this period of lessons. But you're not going to be mentioning potentially people like Athanasius or Boethius, for example. And so really, I would be surprised that if anybody, even if you are studying doing a philosophy degree, if you're doing a bachelor's degree in philosophy, you could at this point in your studies on this second lesson of medieval philosophy, you could name more than 6 medieval philosophers. Okay, I doubt that you could even do that. But for the most part, if I were to apply that same principle to the classical period, or if I were to apply it to the early modern or the modern period, then there is a whole host of new names that you could come up with. Just even post-Socrates, you've got Socrates himself, you've got Plato, you've got Aristotle, you've got Cicero, but you could have also said Thales, Anaximander. You could have also said Empedocles, Pythagoras, Zeno. All of these different names. Any of the Stoic philosophers, any of the Roman philosophers, like Cicero, as I mentioned here with Cicero. If I were to jump into the early modern period, I could name people like Descartes, I could name people like Kant and Hume and Leibniz, Schopenhauer. I could name, and to be fair, at this point, we're starting to move into the actual modern period where we're talking about people like Kant. I could name people like Bertrand Russell, I could name Ludwig Wittgenstein, I could name Quine, I could name Marx, I could name Marx and Engels, I could name Luxemburg. And I'm just thinking about I'm just thinking about political philosophy in that regard at that point. And so the result here is that there is a whole host of different philosophers that you can name going into these periods, but less so in the medieval period. It seems to be the case that this is a sort of, as is colloquially understood, something of a dark age during this period, which is quite an interesting point of reference. Finally, then, I just want to make mention of the influence of non-Christian philosophies. The reason why this is the case is because, of course, this period of history is going to be focusing a lot about the history of Western philosophy through the eyes of the Church Fathers, the scholastic periods, the theologians, the people like Augustine, Athanasius, people like Anselm and Aquinas, people like Boethius, for example, all of which are, even if they are not necessarily Church Fathers in and of themselves, even if they are not necessarily theologians, they are still going to always be looking at it from the perspective of theology, given the fact that the Catholic Church dominated society. Science was understood as part of the Christian understanding. Law, there was the idea of the canon law, developing a system and body of law of the church. You have anything from philosophy to theology to history, all being dominated by our understandings of Christianity. But it is also should be noted that there will also be reference to the influence of Islam, the golden age of Islam, the Muslim golden age during this period will be referenced, as well as the influence of Jewish philosophy. Judaism still existed at this period of time, despite the fact that it was sort of usurped by that of the Christian communities as Christianity exploded with the Roman Empire and the conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity and the development of the Byzantine Empire during this period. But we will also be referencing people like people who are part of the Islamic Golden Age, as well as Jewish philosophers as well.